What's up guys, I'm Jesse from Mole and the Maker, and today we are changing this mom van into an adventure vehicle. So what we're gonna be doing is we're changing this van out. We're gonna make it into the best weekend warrior van that we can. Now this won't be for my family. I have 3 kids. There's no way my wife and I and 3 kids, 2 dogs would fit in this van. So this van is actually for my brother and his wife. So that they can go out camping for 3 to 5 days. They don't have to be in a tent, they can be in a hard shelter, but not only that, have a fridge and have other working accessories, and also that they can drive and easily move from national park to national park or whatever they want to do. Now this series is going to be broken down into a bunch of different steps and videos, so make sure you follow along, make sure you subscribe. This video is going to go over the demo process, the subfloors, and the FlareSpace that we added to the van. So make sure you subscribe, like the video. Let's get into the build. So for the first part of the process, we're going to be doing demo day. Now this van had 3 seats that we need to remove, so we took all those out, and then the next step was to take out the brackets that held them in place. Now we had to use a pipe on a socket wrench to actually loosen them because they were on so tight. But we're able to slowly get all of those brackets off. We quickly sold those for $300, which those $300 will just go towards the build, which is just awesome. So the first step was to do the demo process. And that means taking out all the sidewalls, that means taking out the roof, the flooring, everything like that. And we started with the flooring. The carpet was really easy once those brackets were off, just to pop up, drag it out, and move on to the sidewalls. The sidewalls had a lot more plastic pieces that were popped in, so we had to take a hammer and kind of pry things off and break it because we knew we weren't going to use it anymore. We were just going to go throw it away. So that's what we did. Behind certain doors and certain wires, there were a bunch of connections we did have to disconnect, including the one on the ceiling. So as we were tearing out everything, we made sure that we were careful and we actually unplugged the battery. That way we didn't get shocked as we started cutting wires, if we did cut any or anything like that. All the panels were really easy to take off. Like I said, most of them just snapped on. There were some that we did take a Sawzall to and cut off. It just made life a little bit easier. And then as we got up to the driver and passenger front, we want to keep some of that trim on, especially around the seat belts. So we actually cut around that so we can case it and keep some of that plastic where it is. Now on all the barn door windows, we kept this plastic trim. So all the doors, we kept the top part. We took the bottom off. This would just felt like it'd be a little harder to replicate. I mean, we could do it, it'd just be a little time consuming, and if it doesn't look terrible, why not leave it? So the bottom we took off because we're gonna be adding things here. Obviously this is a large compartment that we can use for the future, so we took that off and on all the doors, but we left the top on. Now on one of the walls there was a ventilation that went all the way through, because in these kinds of vans there's actually a rear AC heater unit that powers the whole back. So the front has its own and the back has its own. Well, we want to take that out. It's really big, cumbersome. We're not going to be using it. We're going to be using a different kind of AC unit or heater, and we didn't need that one anymore. So what we did was we actually cut the pipes underneath. Now let's stop right there for a second, because one of those pipes is for the AC and it is highly pressurized. So don't do necessarily what we did. There's much safer ways to do it. But what we did is we cut the pipes off where there was rubber, just took a Sawzall and cut them off. Luckily we were sitting away and we were using some goggles, which you'll see. And when we cut it, it blew all that pressure out. And so now the AC does not work on either the front and the back, so we will have to cap those lines. And then the coolant that runs to the back as well, we basically reversed it with a pipe onto itself, and so that way the coolant isn't affected. After those were cut, we took out the AC unit and everything else, and pretty much the sidewalls were completely bare and we're ready to go. And then we moved on to the ceiling. So for the ceiling, we ripped off the top liner. Now that liner wasn't really held on very hard. It was with these plastic pieces, and they just get shoved into these holes up here. Now we just started ripping that out. Once we got the first one on, we could just leverage all the other ones out. Then when we got to the front, we want to keep the whole front part because it looks good already, and we didn't want to have to put wood and curve it down and whatnot near the front. So we're going to leave that liner up front. Now we didn't pop down those because a lot of them broke. So the plastic ones broke. We didn't want to break those ones if we're going to be reusing them. And we don't know if we will be, but if we do, we didn't want to break them. So we just cut it with a Sawzall all the way across. Now there was one wire that went along the top with the where the ventilation was for the AC for the back unit, but also there were some lights. So we made sure that we unplugged that, which was behind the driver's side seat belt, and we unplugged that. And then once we got it unplugged, we had cut that off because we'll be using that possibly later in the build. The last thing we did is we added these strips of, it's like a black tar rubber material that it's sticky and it adds to it. Well, we had somebody suggest on Instagram that we use that and it'll help deaden the noise and kind of silence it while you're driving. Now it has helped already. Now that we've gotten to the point where we can drive this again, it has helped a lot. We put it in the doors and we also put it on the ceiling, and it does help. So if you guys are interested in that, or if you have a van like this, that's something that I would suggest. It's already, we've already seen a difference. After the demo, it's time to move on to the floor. So what we did to start was we unrolled a insulation, a small insulation, and a vapor barrier. It looks very similar to bubble wrap, but it's a small insulation that we rolled out and before we put down our strips to adhere our plywood to. So for the strips, we used 1x3s. We took 3 different drills just to make sure that we got it in and flush. And we took these self-tapping screws. Now this is something that, looking back, we would have changed. Instead of putting the vapor barrier down and screwing through the vapor barrier into the wood or into the floor, we would have changed that so where we just glued the 1x3s to the floor. I think that way there's no holes in the flooring or anything like that. Now that being said, we're not too worried about it. We made our decision and now we're moving on with it. So we put a bunch of strips of the 1x3 down where we kind of measured out where the plywood would be. Obviously there's a whole sheet of plywood here, a 4 foot by 8 foot. So we had to make sure they're lined up. So we lined that up, added all those down, and then in between the strips, we added a 1/2 inch foam insulation all over the floor. Take 2. Oh, okay, sorry. Installation. Once the foam insulation was all in place, it was time to screw down the plywood to our strips of 1x3s. Now on one side we had a special awkward cut which goes around the wheel well and also around the tank. So we measured it out and sketched it and did as best we could, and it actually didn't come out too bad at all. Once we get the wood that covers over both of the tire wells, that will cover up the gap, and then also the side walls will cover up the gaps on the sides, so you won't ever see it. After the flooring, it was time to move on to the FlareSpace. Now this is one of our favorite parts of the build, is the FlareSpace. What this does is it adds 5 inches of space sideways in your van, and you can build a bed platform that's a little bit higher up so you can have storage all underneath, but then you can actually fit a full-size bed sideways instead of long ways. It saves you a ton of space, and that's why it's called FlareSpace. The first part of the process was to take off the old windows. Now on these Econoline ones, they're actually bolted on, so you have to unbolt all the bolts and then kind of slowly press on the window so it doesn't break or anything, but slowly press the glue off. Once we pried that all off, we just put them to the side, and it was time to put on the fiberglass FlareSpace. Now FlareSpace has a ton of different videos that you can follow online that you can look and see how to apply these to all the different vehicles. They have them for the Mercedes and other ones, but this is the Econoline one, and it actually is designed to fit exactly into the mold of the window. The first step to our process was to clean up the entire window. we had all this black gunk and glue that the manufacturer uses to hold the window on. We had to clean that up. Now, using mineral spirits helps a lot, and also just being able to roll it off with your fingers or with a putty knife, that ended up working out really well for us. Now, once all that gunk was off, it was time to sand it down. We had to make sure that there was a rough surface for the new glue to adhere to. So we took a 120 sandpaper, grit sandpaper, and we just sanded it with my orbital sander all the way around, scuffed up the metal just enough that we knew the glue would stick. After we scuffed it up, we wiped it down with mineral spirits, let it dry, and it was time to adhere the FlareSpace onto the vehicle. FlareSpace gives you 3 containers of the glue that they recommend, so you don't have to go out and buy anything. You just hook it up to a gun, you clip off the edge, and you're ready to go. So we got the glue ready. We went through and added a thick bead right in the middle of the fiberglass edging, they call it the glue edge, of the FlareSpace. Now we had duct tape ready on top, so when we put it on, all we had to do is grab it from the top of the ceiling and wrap it all the way down. That way it would hold in place while the glue dried. They recommend the masking tape. We felt like the duct tape would hold better, especially if you know, it gets drops in temp here in Utah, so we want to make sure it held properly. Now, that being said, I think masking tape would have done just fine if we did enough of it, but we used quite a bit of duct tape. The only thing that stinks is now we have to go back, take mineral spirits or a Gooby Gone, and get some of the marks off of the van that it left. Also, we had a bunch of duct tape on hand, and masking tape we had to go buy, so we just decided, let's just do the duct tape. Once we had it actually in place and it was taped down, we had to go through and add a bead to the top. Now, the metal on the van just seemed like it was a little bent in, so we tried to push it out as much as we could, and then we added that extra caulk line on the top, and that glue seemed to really seal it in. We are going to go back through and use some mineral spirits and clean up any of the edges where we had got some extra glue we weren't so clean with. That stuff is really hard to work with, but it works really well once it's in place. Then we let those dry for about 2 days. We put it into the shop, parked it there, left it, made sure that there was no water on it or anything, and just let it dry. The recommendations on the instructions is 12 hours, but we just let it for 2 days just to be safe, and plus it was over the weekend where we just didn't want to work on it. The last thing we need to do is put in the windows. Now, these windows have a bracket that goes on the inside, and then it squeezes a liner that is a rubber liner and gasket that's on the front as well. Now, as you use the self-tapping metal screws, it pulls it all together. Now, the first day we tried, it was really hard to, the gap was so big that the screws didn't actually even want to touch. So what we ended up doing after contacting FlareSpace, they gave us some advice. We ended up using some clamps to clamp them together. And as they clamped, that rubber gasket on the outside was able to squeeze enough that those screws were able to touch and really pull it in. Now, we took out the screen when we did clamp it. I mean, it's the only way we could clamp it that way. And it's really easy. It just pops into a little groove, and then a magnet holds that screen in place. So they make it very easy for you to install. The last thing to do with the FlareSpace is to water test it. So you want to take a hose and just spray a lot of water all over it, just to make sure no water is coming in through any of the cracks, crevices, whether it's the window or the glue around the fiberglass. You just want to make sure that's sealed, especially before we start building even more on the inside, because we don't want to get it all done and then find out later that we've missed a spot and now it leaks when it rains. So we water tested it. It's sealed up just fine, and it works great. Well, that's it for day one. It has been a fun process to start this build and to really see it change already. It's actually looks way better than it did before. I want to thank FlareSpace for sending us the flares. We think it looks way better already, and luckily the primer on the FlareSpace pretty much matches the van. So when eventually our plan is to wrap it, but for now it looks great. So thanks, FlareSpace. Make sure you follow them. Their website is in the description. Make sure you subscribe, follow along. It's gonna be a really fun process. Like I said, we have a lot of things to do, building the cabinetry, doing the lights, the ceiling, figure out how we wanna do the fridge, and building stoves and bar tops and everything else. It's gonna be a lot of fun. Make sure you follow along, subscribe, and check out some of these videos over here. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.